Sarah Palmer clutched the letter in her trembling hands, the words blurring as tears threatened to spill onto the weathered paper. Her husband, James, dead in a mining accident, leaving her alone with their 6-year-old daughter, Abigail, in the unforgiving Wyoming territory of 1876. The stagecoach rattled beneath her as it made its final approach to Laramie, the place that would now have to become home. "Mama, are we almost there?" Abigail's small voice barely carried over the rumble of wheels against the dusty trail. Her once rosy cheeks had grown hollow during their journey from Boston, her appetite diminishing with each passing mile. "Yes, sweetheart. Your grandfather's ranch is just beyond those hills." Sarah smoothed her daughter's copper hair, trying to ignore how thin her child had become. Since James's death 3 months prior, Abigail had barely eaten enough to keep a bird alive, and Sarah's worry had grown as steadily as her daughter had withered. The stagecoach rounded the bend, revealing a sprawling landscape dotted with cattle and framed by distant mountains. Dust devils swirled across the plains, wild and free in a way Sarah had never known in her Boston upbringing. Her father-in-law, Walter Palmer, had written immediately upon hearing of his son's death, offering his home to them both. Sarah had never met the man James had left ranch life behind years ago, determined to make his fortune in the East. The driver called out as they approached a wooden archway bearing the brand of the Rocking P Ranch. Sarah gathered their meager belongings as the coach slowed. Through the window, she saw a weathered man astride a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. When the coach finally stopped, Sarah stepped down first, then reached back to help Abigail. The little girl clung to her mother's skirts, eyes downcast. "Mrs. Palmer?" The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Yes? And you must be Walter." Sarah extended her hand, only to be pulled into an unexpected embrace. "Welcome to the Rocking P, and this must be my granddaughter." Walter knelt before Abigail, who shrank further behind Sarah's skirts. "Well now, no need to be shy, little one. Your papa was born right here in this very house." He gestured toward a 2-story structure standing proudly amidst cottonwood trees. "She's been through a lot," Sarah explained quietly, "and she hasn't been eating properly since—" her voice caught. Walter's weathered face softened with understanding. "Well, my housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, makes the best apple pie in the Wyoming territory. That ought to tempt any youngin's appetite." But neither Mrs. Finch's legendary apple pie nor the hearty stew prepared for dinner could coax Abigail to eat that evening. She sat silently at the large oak table, pushing food around her plate while Sarah and Walter attempted conversation around the hollow space of grief that connected them. "My boy always was headstrong," Walter reminisced, his voice gruff with emotion. "Once he set his mind on Boston, there was no talking him out of it, just like his mother. God rest her soul." Sarah nodded, trying to keep her composure. "He spoke of you often, and of the ranch. He wanted to bring Abigail here someday." Walter's gaze drifted to his granddaughter. "Well, she's here now, and so are you, for as long as you both need." Later that night, after tucking Abigail into bed in what had once been James's childhood room, Sarah stood at the window overlooking the vast expanse of the ranch. The moon cast silver light across the land, so different from the crowded streets of Boston. She felt utterly lost, a transplanted flower uncertain if she could take root in this wild soil. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called quietly. Walter entered carrying a leather-bound book. "Thought you might like this. It's James's journal from when he was a boy, full of his adventures around the ranch." Sarah accepted the journal, running her fingers over the worn cover. "Thank you." "Mrs. Palmer, Sarah," Walter began hesitantly. "I couldn't help but notice Abigail didn't touch her food. Is that normal?" Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed. "It's been getting worse. The doctor in Boston said it was grief, that she'd improve with time, but—" She shook her head. "I'm frightened for her." "Children are resilient," Walter offered, though his furrowed brow betrayed his concern. "Perhaps the journey tired her out. Things will look brighter in the morning." But morning brought no improvement. Abigail refused breakfast, turning away from even the fresh-baked bread and honey that Mrs. Finch prepared. By midday, Sarah's worry had escalated to panic. "I'm taking her to the doctor in town," she announced to Walter, who was preparing to ride out to check on a new calf. "I'll hitch up the wagon," he said immediately, abandoning his plans. The town of Laramie bustled with activity as they arrived. Cowboys mingled with shopkeepers and ladies in fine dresses along the wooden boardwalks. Walter guided them to a modest building with a sign reading, "Dr. Stephen Oliver, Physician." The doctor was a young man with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. He examined Abigail thoroughly while Sarah hovered nearby, explaining her daughter's recent history. "Physically, I can find nothing wrong," Dr. Oliver finally concluded, "but the mind and spirit affect the body in ways we don't fully understand. Grief can manifest differently in children." "But she must eat," Sarah insisted, frustration edging her voice. "She's becoming so weak." Dr. Oliver considered this, stroking his short beard. "I've seen similar cases. Sometimes a change in approach is needed." He knelt before Abigail. "Do you like horses, Miss Abigail?" The little girl gave a slight nod, the first response she'd shown to anyone since their arrival. "Well, I have a young mare who just had a foal. They're staying at my place just outside town. Perhaps you'd like to visit them tomorrow." Another small nod. "Excellent. But horses need strong people to care for them, people who eat their meals and grow strong." He winked at her before standing to address Sarah. "Bring her by tomorrow afternoon, and in the meantime, don't force the issue of food. Sometimes the more we push, the more they resist." As they left the doctor's office, Walter stopped abruptly. "Wait here a moment," he said, disappearing into the general store. He emerged minutes later with a small paper bag, which he handed directly to Abigail. "Peppermint sticks," he explained as the child peeked inside. "Your father couldn't resist them when he was your age." For the first time since their arrival, a ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. The next afternoon, as promised, Sarah brought Abigail to Dr. Oliver's modest homestead at the edge of town. The doctor was in the corral, tending to a beautiful bay mare and her wobbly-legged foal. "Right on time," he called, waving them over. "Come meet Daisy and her new daughter." Abigail approached the fence cautiously, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the gentle mare nuzzling her foal. "Would you like to pet her?" Dr. Oliver asked, extending his hand to help Abigail climb the fence. Sarah watched nervously as her daughter reached out a tentative hand to stroke the foal's velvety nose. The tension that had gripped Abigail's small frame for months seemed to ease slightly. "She hasn't been named yet," Dr. Oliver said conversationally. "Any suggestions?" Abigail remained silent, but continued petting the foal, who nuzzled against her palm. "Perhaps you can think about it," he continued, unperturbed by her silence. "A good name takes consideration." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Oliver invited them to return the next day. "The foal will be looking for you," he said to Abigail with a gentle smile. Over the next week, their visits to the doctor's homestead became routine. Each day, Abigail spent time with the foal, who grew increasingly attached to the quiet child. And each day, Dr. Oliver would casually offer Abigail a piece of fruit or a biscuit while they watched the horses, explaining that sharing food was part of friendship. "Animals understand when we share our provisions," he explained. "It's a sign of trust." To Sarah's amazement, Abigail occasionally accepted these offerings, taking small bites as she watched the foal frolic around its mother. One afternoon, as they were preparing to leave, Abigail tugged on Dr. Oliver's sleeve. "Star," she whispered. "Pardon?" He knelt to her level. "Her name is Star," Abigail repeated, pointing to the foal's white blaze shaped vaguely like a star. "Star," Dr. Oliver nodded seriously. "That's a perfect name." Sarah's heart swelled at the sound of her daughter's voice, unused for so long. She met Dr. Oliver's eyes over Abigail's head, mouthing a silent "thank you" that he acknowledged with a modest nod. As they mounted their wagon for the return to the rocking pea, Dr. Oliver approached Sarah. Would you consider bringing Abigail to help with Star's training? I could use an assistant, and it seems they've bonded." "Of course," Sarah agreed readily. "It's the first interest she's shown in anything since her father." "I understand," he said quietly. "And speaking of understanding, I'd like to share something with you." He glanced toward Abigail, who was watching the horses from the wagon. "When I was 10, I lost my mother. For months afterward, I couldn't eat. Food turned to ash in my mouth. My father tried everything, bribes, threats, even force-feeding, but nothing worked." "What changed?" Sarah asked, drawn to the personal revelation. "My aunt came to stay with us. Instead of demanding I eat, she simply sat with me at every meal. She'd talk about her day, about my mother's childhood, about nothing at all. She ate her meals slowly, and occasionally would place a small portion on my plate, not commenting whether I touched it or not." His eyes grew distant with memory. "One evening, without really thinking about it, I took a bite, then another. My aunt never remarked on it, just continued her story. But from that day forward, I began to heal." Sarah considered his words. "You think I should do the same with Abigail?" "I think sometimes the greatest gift we can give is patient presence," he replied. "No expectations, no pressure. Just companionship in the hard moments." That evening at dinner, Sarah implemented Dr. Oliver's suggestion. Instead of coaxing Abigail to eat, she simply sat beside her daughter, chatting with Walter about their day and occasionally placing small morsels on Abigail's plate without comment. The pattern continued for days. Mornings were spent helping Walter with light ranch chores, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, tasks that Abigail could assist with despite her weakened state. Afternoons were devoted to visiting Star, who grew more playful and strong each day. And evenings found Sarah sitting patiently beside her daughter at the dinner table, maintaining a steady conversation while Abigail's food remained largely untouched. A week passed this way, then another. Dr. Oliver became a regular presence in their lives, not only supervising Abigail's interaction with Star, but also joining them occasionally for dinner at Walter's invitation. "Never seen a doctor so interested in horses," Walter commented one evening after Dr. Oliver had departed. "He says working with animals heals the spirit," Sarah replied, gathering dishes from the table. "And I'm inclined to believe him. Abigail is speaking more each day." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "And it doesn't hurt that the good doctor seems quite taken with you." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been kind to us, that's all." Walter's knowing smile suggested he wasn't convinced. Kind enough to ride 5 miles out of his way most evenings just to check on a patient who's visiting his homestead every afternoon anyway. Sarah busied herself with the dishes, unwilling to acknowledge the flutter in her chest whenever Dr. Oliver Stephen, as he'd asked her to call him, was near. It felt disloyal to James, whose memory still occupied every corner of her heart. The turning point came unexpectedly on a stormy evening in late spring. Rain lashed against the windows of the ranch house, making their usual visit to Star impossible. Abigail had been particularly withdrawn all day, missing her equine friend. At dinner, Sarah sat in her usual place beside Abigail, speaking softly about how the rain would help the wildflowers bloom. She placed a small piece of roast beef on her daughter's plate, then continued her one-sided conversation. "Perhaps tomorrow we can gather some of those flowers for Star," she suggested. "Dr. Oliver says horses appreciate beautiful things too." To her astonishment, Abigail picked up her fork, speared the piece of meat, and brought it to her lips. The bite disappeared into her mouth as naturally as if she'd never stopped eating. Sarah froze, hardly daring to breathe. Across the table, Walter's eyes widened, but he followed Sarah's lead in not acknowledging the momentous event. Slowly, deliberately, Abigail took another bite, then another. By the end of the meal, she had cleaned her entire plate, something that hadn't happened since before James's death. Later, after tucking an exhausted Abigail into bed, Sarah allowed her tears of relief to flow freely. She stood on the covered porch, watching the rain while emotions coursed through her as powerfully as the water streaming from the eaves. She ate, she whispered to the storm, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. She ate. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean by the night's deluge. Sarah was stirring a pot of oatmeal when Abigail appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Is there honey?" the little girl asked, her voice small but steady. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the honey pot. "Of course, sweetheart." At breakfast, Abigail ate a full bowl of oatmeal, then asked for another. Walter winked at Sarah over his coffee cup, his weathered face alight with joy. "Thought we might ride out to see the new calves today," he suggested casually. "That is, if you ladies are interested." Abigail nodded eagerly. "Can we tell Dr. Oliver about them when we see Star?" "Certainly," Sarah agreed, marveling at the transformation. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing not only Abigail's appetite but also her voice and spirit. Their visit to see Star that afternoon was filled with more of Abigail's chatter than all their previous visits combined. She told Dr. Oliver about the calves, about the wildflowers they'd gathered on the way, about how her grandfather had let her hold the reins of the wagon for part of the journey. Stephen listened attentively, his gaze occasionally drifting to Sarah with unmasked admiration. When Abigail ran to the corral to give Star the wildflowers, he moved closer to Sarah. "She seems transformed," he observed quietly. Sarah nodded, emotion making speech difficult. Last night she ate an entire meal, and this morning she asked for seconds. "That's wonderful news." His genuine pleasure in Abigail's progress warmed Sarah more than the spring sunshine. "What do you think made the difference?" "Your advice," Sarah replied simply. "Just sitting with her, no demands or expectations. Last night she finally took a bite." Stephen's smile deepened. "I'm glad I could help, though I suspect your patience and love had more to do with it than any medical advice." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched Abigail with the foal. Finally, Stephen spoke again, his voice hesitant. "Sarah, I hope this isn't too forward, but I've been wanting to ask, would you and Abigail consider joining me for a picnic this Sunday, after church services?" The invitation hung in the air between them. Sarah thought of James, of the grief still fresh in her heart, but she also thought of the way Stephen looked at her, not with pity, but with genuine appreciation. The way he'd helped bring Abigail back from the brink with patience and understanding. "We'd be delighted," she found herself saying. The Sunday picnic became another weekly ritual. After church services, they'd ride to a scenic spot by the river, where Stephen would produce a basket filled with Mrs. Finch's fried chicken and biscuits, supplemented by his own contributions of fresh berries or early summer vegetables from his garden. Abigail flourished under the combined attention of her grandfather, her mother, and Dr. Oliver. Her appetite returned in full force, and with it, her energy and curiosity. She spent hours helping Walter with ranch chores, visiting Star, or exploring the countryside under careful supervision. As spring melted into summer, Sarah found her own heart healing alongside her daughter's. The raw wound of James's death would always leave a scar, but the acute pain had begun to subside, replaced by fond memories and gratitude for the time they'd shared. One warm July evening, as Abigail helped Mrs. Finch shell peas on the porch, Stephen invited Sarah for a walk along the creek that ran through the rocking pea property. "I've been meaning to check on those willows I planted last month," he explained, though his nervous energy suggested other motives. They strolled in comfortable silence until they reached the young trees, which were taking root nicely along the creek bank. Stephen examined them with professional interest before turning to Sarah with determination in his eyes. "Sarah, there's something I need to say." Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "Yes?" "These past months, watching you with Abigail, seeing your strength and gentleness, I've developed feelings I never expected to find again after my wife died." Sarah's breath caught. "Your wife? You never mentioned—" "It was many years ago before I came to Laramie," he explained quickly. "Typhoid took her and our unborn child. I threw myself into medicine afterward, determined to save others from such loss." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding now why he'd connected so deeply with their grief. I've learned that hearts can heal, given time and proper care. He took her hands in his. Sarah Palmer, I'm falling in love with you, and with Abigail too, if I'm being honest. I know it may be too soon, and I'll respect whatever boundaries you need, but I wanted you to know the truth of my heart. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, not of sorrow, but of unexpected joy. It's not too soon, she whispered. James would want us to be happy. He always said life was too precious to waste in sadness. Stephen's face lit with hope. Then may I court you properly, with Walter's blessing, of course. Sarah laughed, a sound of pure delight. Walter has been practically pushing us together for months. I think his blessing is assured. Their courtship bloomed throughout the summer and into the golden days of autumn. Stephen became a fixture at the Rocking Pea, arriving for dinner most evenings and spending his days off helping with ranch work or teaching Abigail to ride Star, who had been gifted to the child on her 7th birthday. By Christmas, it was clear to everyone in Laramie that the town doctor and the rancher's daughter-in-law were destined for marriage. Stephen proposed on Christmas Eve, presenting Sarah with a simple gold band engraved with intertwined hearts. One for each of us, he explained, you, me, and Abigail. Their wedding in April of 1877 was the social event of the season. The entire town turned out to witness the union, held in the meadow where they'd shared their first picnic. Abigail, radiant in a dress the color of spring bluebonnets, stood proudly beside her mother, holding a bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning. Walter gave the bride away, his weathered face streaming with unashamed tears of joy. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Abigail was the first to cheer, her healthy, robust voice carrying across the assembled guests. The newlyweds established their home at Stephen's property on the edge of town, expanded now to accommodate their growing family. Sarah planted a garden, using skills learned from Mrs. Finch. Stephen continued his medical practice but structured his schedule to allow for family dinners, a sacrosanct time when they gathered to share not only food, but the events of their day. Walter visited often, delighting in his role as doting grandfather and surrogate father. Under his tutelage, Abigail became an accomplished horsewoman, her earlier frailty now just a distant memory. A year after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to a son they named James Walter Oliver, honoring both her first husband and the man who had become a father to her. Abigail took to big sisterhood with enthusiasm, helping care for her brother with the same attentiveness she showed to Star. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in hues of gold and crimson, Stephen reached for Sarah's hand. "Do you remember the day Abigail first started eating again?" he asked. Sarah nodded, the memory still precious. "How could I forget? It felt like a miracle." "In a way, it was," Stephen agreed. "But it was a miracle born of patience and love. You sat beside her until a bite finally passed her lips. You never gave up on her." "Just as you never gave up on us," Sarah replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "When I arrived in Laramie, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was just beginning." From inside the house came Abigail's laughter, followed by baby James's delighted gurgle. The sounds of healing, of family, of home, sweeter than any music to Sarah's ears. Stephen pressed a kiss to her temple. "To beginnings," he murmured. "And to patient hearts that find their way to healing." In the distance, a lone rider approached the homestead Walter, coming to join them for their nightly ritual of shared food and conversation. The family circle would be complete, gathered around the table where once a grieving child had refused to eat, and where now abundance and joy overflowed. As the years passed, the Oliver family thrived in Laramie. Stephen's medical practice expanded to include a proper clinic in town, where he treated everything from mining injuries to childbirth complications. Sarah, drawing on her Boston education, established a small school on their property, initially just for Abigail and neighboring ranch children, but eventually growing to serve dozens of local families. Abigail grew into a confident young woman. Her childhood grief transformed into compassion for others. She assisted in her stepfather's clinic, displaying a natural talent for medicine that made Stephen beam with pride. Star remained her constant companion, the bond between girl and horse, a testament to the healing power of such connections. In 885, Sarah gave birth to their second child together, a daughter they named Hope Elizabeth Oliver. By then, 11-year-old James was already showing signs of following in Walter's footsteps, preferring the open range to school books. Walter, though slowed by age, remained the patriarch of their extended family, dividing his time between the Rocking Pea Ranch, now managed by his capable foreman, and the Oliver homestead. His greatest joy was teaching his grandchildren the ways of ranch life, just as he'd once taught his son James. On calm summer evenings, the family often gathered on the porch after dinner, watching the children play in the yard while the adults sipped coffee and shared stories. It was during one such evening, as 12-year-old Abigail helped 3-year-old Hope feed a carrot to Star, that Sarah reflected aloud on their journey. "Sometimes I think about that little girl who arrived in Laramie, too grief-stricken to eat," she said softly, "and I marvel at how far we've come." Stephen squeezed her hand. "Life has a way of bringing us exactly what we need, even when it comes disguised as hardship." From his rocking chair, Walter nodded sagely. "My boy would be proud to see his family thriving. That's all any father wants." As twilight deepened into night and the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Sarah and Stephen stood together at their bedroom window, looking out at the land that had become home. The moon silvered the distant mountains, the same moon that had witnessed their individual sorrows and collective healing. "Do you ever regret it?" Stephen asked suddenly. "Coming west, starting over?" Sarah turned to him, cupping his beloved face in her hands. "Not for a single moment. This is where we were meant to be." She kissed him gently, then added, "Besides, I found something here I never expected." "What's that?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. "A hungry heart that found its fill," she answered simply. "Not just Abigail's, but mine as well." Outside, a night bird called to its mate across the Wyoming darkness, a sound both wild and comforting, much like the love that had blossomed against all odds on the frontier, where a doctor's patience and a mother's devotion had coaxed a grieving child to take that first healing bite, and in doing so, nourished all their souls.